Part 1.
My guest today is the novelist Greg Field. Greg, you started writing quite young. Were you into books and reading as a kid?
Well, funnily enough, my parents were always on at me to read. They couldn't understand why I didn't like it much. But if we went to a library, it was all serious and silent and slow and not lively at all. One summer, though, I was in my grandma's sitting room and she had this whole pile of books, which she let me play with because I liked the covers. And I started leafing through, and then maybe reading a word or two, and then a page, and then that was it.
And what about at school?
Well, in fact, school added another dimension. We'd got school books, of course, history books and maths books that we'd work through, though I much preferred finding out about stuff online. But there was one particular teacher we had, who at the end of every day would get out a book, maybe poems or a story, and read them to us. It was like music, like a film, these great pictures his voice summoned up in my mind. And that's when I knew I had to be a writer, so I could make that happen too.
So, how did it feel when you eventually achieved that?
Well, I was so scared when I was writing my first novel. Scared that nobody would read it, that I'd never finish it, or I'd lose it, or that the publisher would change her mind, etc., etc. I can't tell you what a relief it was to see it on the shelves in a bookshop. Then the next one was, by comparison, a bit of a disappointment. The reviews were pretty bad and it never sold as well. But these days I just have this nice, calm feeling about the whole business.
Tell us about where and how you write.
I write in a small room at the top of my house. There's no sound, no music, no traffic, and that's what I need to get a sense that my words are filling something. I've tried writing in other rooms in the house, but I find it harder to settle down to work. I don't use a computer, just a pen, any kind of pen. I don't have a special one anymore. Losing it was too traumatic. And I do look out of the window a lot, and I drink cup after cup of tea. And yes, it's a special cup.
So, tell us about your next novel.
Next is a book for teenagers. At least, I hope they'll like it. I never tried writing one before. It's set about 100 years ago, and it's about school-aged children in the country who are sent off from their farms to work in a factory at a young age, and the hard times they have. Like all my historical novels, it has a serious message, but there are lighter moments too.
Any advice for budding young writers out there, Greg?
Well, if it's your first book, does that mean first person? People often write their first book about themselves and from the I perspective. Of course, you're likely to write best about what you know, to be most convincing. But bear in mind that if you do that, there might be a lot of stuff you can't include. And your readers may want to know about other things that you don't see.
Anything to avoid?
Well, it's very dull if you set everything in the same place, of course, or always have them wearing the same clothes. Their choice of clothes can tell you about a character's personality. And an important aspect of writing fiction is the use of symbols, for example, the weather representing how people are feeling. But resist the urge to spell everything out. The sky was grey, fine. Not the sky was grey and John felt as grey inside as the sky was, etc.
That sounds like good advice. Thanks, Greg.
Part 2.
Hi, my name's Britt Foxton, and I'm the founder of a website devoted to women's basketball, and I've also just written a book on the same subject. But first up, let me tell you how I got started with the site. Although it really got going once I was at university, it actually started out as a high school project. You know, a design a website kind of thing. But it wasn't like anyone expected it to become real or anything. I designed a site about girls' basketball, which I was passionate about, and called it femalebasket.com. I knew the name wasn't right, and before it got really successful, I changed it to matchgirl.com, and that was a really good move. And although it started with basketball, the site's kind of evolved to include other games as well. It features a variety of articles, reviews, and editorials on everything ranging from basketball to computer games, plus a smattering of more traditionally girly material as well. But the coverage of team sports is at the heart of it. Anything about makeup or fashion is just peripheral. Then there's my book. That was a quite different sort of challenge. It's on the subject of girls' basketball and overall took about 3 months to do. I knew I wanted to write it late last year and started to loosely plan it out in January of this year. It wasn't until May that I had enough time to get down to doing everything I'd envisioned, but it was all done by the end of July. And in researching the book, I came across some pretty interesting facts, like women actually began playing basketball less than a year after the men's game was invented back in 1892. It didn't become an Olympic sport until 1976, however, whereas the men's game was in there from 1936, and that tells you a lot about how it developed. People ask me whether we'd recognise the game the way it started or if it's changed. Well, the biggest difference is in clothing. Back then, in the USA, women were required to play in full-length dresses. The only body parts that could be exposed were fingers, necks and heads. And it wasn't only the discomfort they suffered, it led to quite a few broken bones because players tended to trip over their skirts and stuff. Of course, no way did the men have these problems. Then, at the end of a woman's game, there'd be like handkerchiefs and hairpins scattered all over the court, which of course wasn't the case with the men either. So you can see how the two developed in quite different ways, even with a differently sized court for many years. Of course, things did change, but quite slowly, really. Appropriate clothing came in gradually, but even well into the 20th century, some other rules applied to women, but not to men. Not so much the equipment, but silly things like chewing gum was specifically prohibited in the women's game because it was considered unfeminine, not because it was dangerous or anything. And I've got some good stories from those years in the book, I think. Like when in 1936, a team of women basketball players called the Redheads toured the country playing exhibitions against men's teams. Strange thing was, though, these girls not only had to wear the same clothes, they all had to have red hair. Most of them had to dye it specially. Isn't that unbelievable? But looking back on the writing of the book, if I did it again, I'd do it all differently. I know I ought to be proud of what I've done, but I'm such a perfectionist. Given the chance, I'd add significantly more information on the cultural traditions and really address the growing basketball fan base. But who knows? Maybe there's another book in there somewhere. Now, before I show you some of the wonderful...
Part 3.
Trina, you're 15 and you've just come back from America where you've been making records. What was it like?
It was wonderful. I had the 6-week school summer holidays and, went over there for a month and then started school again.
What did your classmates at school think?
I just told close friends what I was doing in the States. And I thought, well, if the records were successful, then I'd tell everyone.
And they were successful.
Right. And my friends were very good about it. Not envious or anything.
Did you like being in the USA?
Oh, yes. Most of the time it was great. The people are so friendly.
Did you manage to write any songs there?
Well, yeah, I did. Most of the stuff I'd done in England had been about the people closest to me. Mum, Dad, my sister. They weren't with me in the States. And although I missed them, and silly things like the rain in England and fish and chips, being surrounded with new faces gave me lots of material for my songs.
Now, your home in England is a long way from London.
Yes, about as far as you can get.
So, is it easy to get into the music business if you live that far away? Don't you have to be in London or near a big city at least?
No. We did play in London once, but we were actually approached at a local concert, so I don't think it's impossible to get noticed anywhere. There are lots of record companies looking for bands, and they do go quite a long way from the cities to find them. I was lucky with my band, and there have been other bands like us that have been lucky as well, so you don't have to come from a huge city to be discovered.
Now, in the USA, you did a song with someone who was a star when I was your age, David Pearson, and you hadn't any idea who he was.
No, it was embarrassing, actually, but he was a really pleasant guy.
Yeah?
He was recording an album in the same studio, and he had this song that he needed someone to sing with him, and he asked me, and I was only too delighted to do it.
But that wasn't the only famous star you worked with in the States, was it?
No, there was Lance Lakatoff.
But you had heard of him?
Yes. He's a bit of a hero of mine, in fact.
And you were in his TV series?
Yes.
And what was that like?
It was a really good experience. I hadn't done anything like that before. And they filmed us for 3 or 4 days, and that was the end of it. Or so I thought. But they'd made some mistakes, which was such a shame, because I had to go back to the USA.
Oh.
I came home to England, and then they phoned up and said they had some bad camera work, etc., and I had to fly all the way back and do it again.
Actually, in the USA, your record did well, but not here in England. Why's that?
Because you've never been able to get it over here in Britain. The record company's never had any arrangements to sell their records in Britain, so it's always just been the USA, which is nice in a way.
Why'd you say that?
Well, it's good to come home and get away from it.
But is it that the company don't think your style will appeal over here?
No, it's purely the fact they don't operate over here. But the company's just been sold, and the new company does operate over here, so maybe they will release the record.
So, where do you see your career going? Will you go back to the States?
Well, not for a while, I shouldn't think, as I have another 2 years at school here in England. I know my school friends are thinking of college, but I'm not sure that's for me, even to do music. Then my agent has been trying to persuade me to do it full time, and my parents say it's up to me, but I'm happy to wait a while before that happens. I can still write, after all. In fact, one of my songs is in the American charts at the moment, but sung by someone else.
Well, the best of luck, Trina. And now here's Trina's...
Part 4.
Visitors to the small Devon village of Wimple might be forgiven for looking twice as they pass the garden of Elizabeth Holmes. In the middle of the garden, there stands a traditional African hut, a reminder of the 2 years Elizabeth spent in Africa as a volunteer. Elizabeth, what persuaded you to leave your secure job in a travel agent's and go to Africa?
Well, I'd been feeling restless for ages. I wanted to see the real world, not just tourist places. Then I was at the dentist one day, waiting to go in, and I'd read all the magazines in the waiting room, so I started looking at a poster. It was all about volunteers working in Africa.
And it interested you?
Yes. I took down the name and address and applied. I had an interview locally and did some aptitude tests. Then just before I left for Africa, there was a training weekend in London which they call Changes, and which gives you some idea of what you're letting yourself in for.
What particular skills could you offer?
I had a degree in economics, and I'd done some teaching at one time. What they wanted to send me to Africa to do was to train local farmers in the marketing of their produce. I flew out with 15 other volunteers, all going to do different things like nursing, teaching and so on. When we got there, we were supposed to have a 4-week course at a training centre learning something about the local culture and the basics of the language, you know, greetings and things like that. Anyway, there was a problem and it only lasted 3 weeks in the end. Not enough, really.
Did it take a long time to get used to your new lifestyle?
I found it quite difficult for the first few weeks, but after that I settled in very well. My area covered 1,200 square kilometres, and I had a truck for long-distance travel, but for more local trips I rode a motorbike.
How did you get on with the local people?
Very well. The men were very polite, but they tended to keep their distance, unlike the women who were always inviting me to meals. They showed me how they wove and dyed material to make clothes for themselves and their children. I used to get magazines sent from England, and we'd spend ages looking at them.
I expect you found it very different when you returned to England.
Yes, I certainly did. After 2 years of living very simply, I found the supermarkets especially overwhelming. Just the enormous choice of food. Also, the traffic disturbed me. I had to move from my flat in the city to a small cottage in the country just to get some of the peace and quiet I'd become accustomed to in Africa.
And what are you working on at the moment?
Well, I didn't want to just go back to working in someone else's office, so I set up my own business, which I run from home. I deal in African furniture. I bought some small pieces back with me as souvenirs, and everyone loved them in Britain. However, I'm still in touch with the organisation that sent me to Africa as a volunteer. I organise events to raise funds and give talks about my experience to encourage other people to go.
Has the experience in Africa changed you at all?
Oh, yes, in many ways. I used to spend all my time working, but now I make sure I have more time for gardening, my favourite hobby.
Well, I'd like to thank Elizabeth for coming into the studio today. If you're interested in having